Hey guys, we're going to go ahead and get started. Our speaker today is Dr. Tim McGrew, and he is the chair of the philosophy department at Western Michigan University. So he is here from out of town, and he's here for 6 days speaking at 13 different places, and he agreed to come and speak to us. And he's going to be sharing with us about science and how our faith is rational and agrees with science. So if y'all would give a big warm welcome to Dr. Tim McGrew. And I'll pray for us real quick before he gets started. Dear Lord, we just come before you humbled that you have let us be a part of your work. And so thankful for Dr. McGrew coming and speaking with us. I just ask that you would give him the words to say, and that the things he says would be planted on rich soil for each of us, and that we would take something away that would make us more like you and able to follow you better. In Christ's name, amen.
Thank you all for having me here. What Jacqueline forgot to tell you is that you are guinea pigs. This is the first time I've given this talk. Putty gave me the topic, and I said, okay, I'll put something together. So if it's a little rough around the edges, just sort of roll with it. And I designed it to not be super long. I'm going to try to get some ideas out there, and then we'll just open it up for Q&A, and we can talk about this. Also, don't kill yourself trying to take notes. I'll give them the slides. They can distribute them to everybody. So if there's something on those slides, and you're saying, oh, I got to get that name down. Try, but if you don't, it's okay. So I want to make it easy on those of you who take notes, because you are wonderful people. I love people who take notes. I'm a professor after all. Does science make faith irrational? Obviously, here I stand as a Christian who professionally teaches the history and philosophy of science. I love science. I don't think that it makes faith irrational, but there are people who disagree. Let's look at a couple of those people. Here's a quotation from a well-known population geneticist, Will Provine. Let me summarize my views on what modern evolutionary biology tells us loud and clear. And these are basically Darwin's views. There are no gods, no purposes, and no goal-directed forces of any kind. Well, that's laying it out there. He's being very blunt about what he thinks. Here's another person opining on the subject. This is from an older generation, from 1885, Robert Ingersoll. There is no harmony between religion and science. When science was a child, religion sought to strangle it in the cradle. Now, Ingersoll was not a scientist. He was a lawyer. But this quotation from Ingersoll gets quoted, and I'll show you later a recent book by Jerry Coyne, in which that expression right there, that little quotation, is quoted as the epigraph for one of Coyne's chapters. So he clearly thinks that it expresses the truth. Whenever people make strong-sounding statements like that, the first thing that we have to do is get clear on what is meant. What do you mean by that? So I want to make some distinctions first of different things that different people mean. This being a Baptist ministry, all the back row chairs are filling up, but there are still ones closer to the front, so feel free to come on in and join us. Let's start with the word religion. And now, these are things that I think are pretty obvious that we can say, but maybe they need to be said. Number one, all religions are not the same. They don't believe the same things, they don't have the same sacred texts, and they have to be evaluated, each one on its own merits. We can't just say, well, let's create this basket, call it religion, throw everything into it, condemn it all at once, and be done. That would be a mistake. So I'm going to focus on Christianity, because I figured that might be of more interest to you than Baha'i or something. So we'll talk about Christianity. Point number two, even sincere believers in the same religion often differ about things that are not essential to the religion. So if somebody picks on one person's views, but that person's views are idiosyncratic in some way, they're not really representative of what, say, the New Testament teaches, then we need to be willing to say, all right, you're criticizing so-and-so, but not necessarily criticizing Christianity. Third point, the question to be meaningful should be asked about the essential beliefs of a particular religion, not the non-essentials. You can all think of some things that maybe you have beliefs about, maybe even strong beliefs, and maybe you think they're important, but they're not absolutely central. I'm going to guess in a group this size that some of you would describe yourselves as Calvinists, and some of you would not. And you may have fun arguments or unfun arguments about that, but most of the Calvinists I know will say, yeah, the Arminians are safe, they just have a screwed up soteriology. And most of the Arminians will say, yeah, you're not a non-Christian just because you're a Calvinist, although I really think you need therapy or something. So they have their criticisms of one another, but they'll acknowledge this is not the absolute center of this. God is generous. He allows us to get some things wrong, and still, if we believe the essential things and if we commit ourselves to him, he accepts that. This is good because I don't necessarily think I have every single little piece of my theology perfect. When I do, I'll publish a book and I'll tell you all to buy it. More distinctions. The term science gets used in a bunch of ways, and I think it's important for us to be able to think about this and talk about this. One sense of it is just very broad and general and I think useful, which is an approach to investigating the physical world by looking at physical evidence, by attempting to intervene in situations experimentally, control some factors. That approach to investigating the physical world is enormously successful, and we're all very happy with that. Second meaning, though, it could mean the most current set of beliefs about the physical world. Science as in what the people with the big S's on their sweatshirts mostly agree on now. And that's another meaning of the word. It might not always be the best meaning, but that's okay. It's one that's out there, and we need to be able to engage with that as well. But also, notice the second one is a moving target, right? We have some theories that were very popular and heavily supported 30 years ago that today are just historical curiosities. If you want to see fast-moving fields, look at physical cosmology. I was really interested in astrophysics when I was a kid. I thought about becoming an astrophysicist. It was like either that or a poet. So I wound up as a philosopher. I don't know. Is that halfway in between? I don't know. But all of the astrophysics books that I collected when I was in my teens are now hopelessly out of date. And genetics, don't even get me started on genetics. That's what I did some research in college, and the genetics landscape has just changed out of recognition. It's amazing. So if we're talking about our current beliefs about the physical world, we have to realize time may discard some of those. And the unfortunate thing is we don't know which ones, right? So here we are saying, well, this is our current set of beliefs about the physical world. And that'll change, and we don't know the way it'll change, so we can't even predict which ones will still be retained, which ones will get modified, which ones will be trashed. We don't know. But there's a third meaning that sometimes gets called science, and this is the one I really want us to be alert to, and that is a philosophical position that limits what we can know or what exists to the physical. This is often called naturalism, or sometimes, in a very narrow view of it, materialism. Spoiler alert, this is not science. This is philosophy. Be it good or bad, I will argue that it's bad, but whichever way you want to do that, when a scientist, even if he's wearing a lab coat, says all that we can know is the material world, or all that there is the material world, he is not speaking as a scientist. He is speaking as a philosopher. And a lot of scientists are very fond of speaking as philosophers, especially scientists who tell you, well, philosophy is all bankrupt. Now let me give you my philosophy. It happens. It happens a lot. It happened with a very prominent scientist who has just passed away very recently, Stephen Hawking, who was very antagonistic toward philosophy and whose books consist in significant measure of a lot of philosophy that's being put out there without his recognizing what he's doing. So if somebody says, are science and religion incompatible? Are science and faith incompatible? We need to ask, well, which sense of the word science did you mean? And the answer might be different depending on which sense of the word they're using. Third important word, faith. What is faith? If I said, let's do this as an experiment. I'll just ask you this. Some of you have paper in front of you. Ha, you're trapped. Okay? Take a minute and write down what you would say if somebody said to you, tell me, what is faith? See, some of you are studying your shoelaces, and some of you are biting your lip and wondering what to write, and some of you are jotting along happily. As you're writing, ask yourself this question. If we then, which I won't, but if we collected this quiz and we compared your answers, how many of you do you think would give recognizably the same answer? It's a little bit of an awkward question, maybe. So, here are some definitions of faith. This first one is the simplest one because it's the basic meaning of the Greek word in the New Testament that is translated faith in our Bibles. That word is pistis, and the basic meaning is just trust. At its most fundamental level, faith is trust. Can be trust in a person, can be trust in a book that it's telling the truth. Trust could be well-placed or badly placed, but it's just trust. You know people who are too trusting, they trust people they shouldn't. And you know people who you trust for good reasons, and you would say, yeah, I have excellent reason to trust this person. This person's been my best friend since 3rd grade. I could trust this person with my life. That's what faith is trust in the New Testament. But there's this other meaning, and when we start talking with people, especially people who are antagonistic towards Christianity, we often find that they're insisting on this other meaning. Here's the other meaning. Blind insistence on believing without evidence. Have you ever heard anybody talk like that about faith? Yeah, okay, hands going up, right. Right. Now, I want to point out a few things. First of all, this is a meaning never found in the Bible, Old or New Testament. No word that we translate as faith is ever meaning blind. Faith is often contrasted with something in the Bible, but it's not faith versus reason. It's certainly not faith versus science. What is the contrast? Faith versus what? We walk by faith, not by sight. Right. Sight and faith are contrasted because when you see, you don't have to trust anymore. There it is. It's right there for you. Trust is for things you can't see. It's a meaning that's rarely intended by Christians. When I debated Peter Boghossian on the radio a few years ago, he's a skeptic who has a book out, subtle book. The title is A Manual for Creating Atheists. And right up front in the early chapters, he gives you 2 definitions of faith. The first one is pretending to know things you don't know. And the second one is belief without evidence. So when I debated him on this British radio program, the host, Justin Brierley, said, well, let's just do a little informal quiz. And so he asked people to identify themselves as Christians or as non-Christians, and then asked them, how would you use the word, if you're a Christian? Would you use it to mean belief without evidence? And then ask the atheists, how do you think Christians use the word? What do you think they mean by it? Many of the atheists said Christians mean belief without evidence. Almost none of the Christians said that Christians mean belief without evidence. I think there's a little bit of a disconnect going on. But many atheists have that as the default meaning of the word. And we'll see some of those. So now, in terms of these distinctions that we've been trying to make about science and religion and faith, let's ask the question in a little bit more general manner, okay? Here's how I like to break it down. We've got science as a discipline and the current consensus of beliefs on it, but we've also got naturalism as a philosophical position. Those both get called science sometimes. We have Christianity as taught in the New Testament, with the obvious connections that has back to the Old Testament. And then we've got non-essential beliefs of some Christians, past and present, and non-biblical meanings of the word faith. So what I want to say is, are science and faith, science and religion, in conflict? Well, the current discipline and the current consensus are in conflict with some non-essential beliefs of some Christians. And the methodology of science is certainly in conflict with the non-biblical meaning of faith. But that's not our fight, right? If you're not committed to the idea that faith is just blind trust in something for which you have no evidence, then when somebody tells you, well, science is a methodology for finding things out that does appeal to evidence, yeah, right, I have no problem with that, because that's not the definition of faith that I would want to get behind. So there are problems along that axis, but that's not a problem between the top things. Again, there are problems between philosophical naturalism or materialism and Christianity, because Christianity says there's a God who is not a physical being, who intervenes in the world, makes things happen there, and your materialist philosophy will not permit that. Okay, there's a conflict there. But is that a conflict between religion and science? Not one that Christians who hold to New Testament as their source, who hold to Christianity as taught in the New Testament, have to worry about. Yes, naturalism is false, but science is fine. How many of you would say you just hate science? And I don't mean the class, but the whole practice. Anybody? Any science haters? This is going to go hard with my atheist friends, because they really expect most of you to hate science deep down. I don't mean whether you love the list of alkenes and aldehydes that you have to memorize for your organic chemistry test, but we're talking now about science as a discipline. See, actually, I don't know any Christians who have a problem with science as a discipline. Science is great. Science is wonderful. Probably some of you here are even studying some of the sciences. We have any majors in some of the sciences here? Yep. Wow, my atheist friends are really going to be unhappy, because they tend to agree with the next guy, Jerry Coyne, who is a biologist who's put out a book. These guys love these really subtle titles. Faith versus Fact. Why Science and Religion are Incompatible. But tell us what you really think, Jerry. So here, and he does. Here's a quotation from the book. Science and religion are incompatible, and you must choose between them. He says that's the one thing everybody's afraid of saying, but he's going to say it. If you are trying to be consistent in how you get reliable knowledge about our universe, and if you already reject unevidenced claims like those of ESP and homeopathy, or claims of religions other than yours, then in the end you must choose, and choose science. That doesn't mean you must accept an unchanging set of scientific facts, but simply that you choose reason and evidence over superstition and wish thinking. Which definition of faith as part of religion is he using? It's that three wise monkeys, right? No, don't bother me with the facts. No. That's the definition that he's going after here. If you were committed to that definition of faith, and you were committed to having faith, like, let's be blind, that's really cool, then I would be right there with Jerry Coyne saying, you have a problem. But you're not. But he thinks you are, because you don't agree with him about everything, including the idea that there's no God. Let me give you an example of a Christian who thought a lot about evidence and what he said. And the guy that I'm going to give you is not a scientist, but he was a self-educated cobbler in the 19th century. He had an 8th grade education. And he should make you feel bad. Because with his 8th grade education and a library card, he taught himself 13 languages, mastered vast amounts of material. He gave public lectures on the history of Italy and French painters and poets and Shakespeare, and 51 lectures on the history of England. He was raised Christian, and then he went through a dark period of his life, and he lost his faith. But this fellow, Thomas Cooper, was also extremely honest. So around 1855, he started having doubts about his doubts. He went back over the ground more deeply. He came back to Christianity, got baptized by Spurgeon, and spent the last 30 years of his life giving more than 6,800 lectures and sermons on the evidences of Christianity. Here's what he said in one of those public lectures to a group of workingmen in England. I seek no flighty converts from your ranks, no sudden passing over to our side from yours, or some hot, excitable partisan who is incapable of thinking. I seek to lead you to accept what I believe to be the truth, by inducing you to practice that daily reflection, the steady conning over and over again of each item of the Christian evidences which effectually cured my doubts and rendered me a settled and grateful believer. I would not lift my finger or stir a straw to make a sudden and spasmodic conversion of any one of you, which would leave you helpless in your new belief and incapable of giving a reason of the hope within you. Such a convert would be a very useless one. I want to enlist real soldiers for my master.
Wow, that's good.
I'd just like to say, they don't make open-air preachers like they used to. What a guy. Published some of his lectures in books. This is from one of them, The Verity of Christ's Resurrection from the Dead. Does that sound like someone who, in Jerry Coyne's terminology, is opposed to reason and evidence? No, he's all about looking into it, and he's telling these guys, I'm not doing an altar call here to pull on your emotional strings. I want you to do what I did, which is study the evidence until you have a satisfied mind. Boy, if I could just bottle that up and put it into the water at some of our churches, it would effect an incredible change. And instead of people backing away slowly when tough questions come up, people would start walking toward the questioner saying, that's fantastic. Let's have a meeting and let's just talk about that. True confession. When I was a teenager, I dropped out of my high school youth group in church. And the reason I dropped out of it is that it was fun. And by fun, I mean ice cream socials, roller skating parties, trips to the beach, and never, ever, ever any substance. But if you had told me, hey, we got some folding chairs, let's go in the back and sit down and talk about how a good God could permit so much suffering in this world, I'd have been there like a shot. But nobody had that kind of serious engagement. And I think that your generation needs to send a message. So please, think about this and think about getting out. We're not actually here for the ice cream. We'd like some depth, please. Could we talk about serious issues? Could we talk about dangerous topics? Can we have the freedom to raise some of these? I did a series at one church. They called it Dangerous, the questions you can't ask in church. And it was just a group of people who wanted to meet one night a week. The pastor opened it up. He said, I really want you to feel free to talk about these questions and to raise them without feeling like you're not allowed to in church. And that's why I'm leaving. He handed me the microphone and he walked out. And we got questions people would not have asked in front of the pastor, like, I can get some of the best preaching in the world online. Why do I have to go to church to hear him? Yes. But you know what? He was a big enough man, a secure enough man to understand that people might actually want to say that. And that's why he walked out. So they could. Oh, we could use a lot more of that. Wow. And then we had a good talk about that question and many others. For that question, one of the things that we came around to was, so why should people go to church? Is it all about you and what you get out of it? Or is there more to that? Are you there for something other than how much the church can do for you? Are you there to do anything for anybody else? Does that thought cross your mind? Oh, oh, maybe I am. Maybe there's a reason why Jesus says you shouldn't forsake the gathering of yourselves together. Right. Okay. Long discursions there. I won't go a whole lot longer. I do want, though, to talk more directly about the worry that somehow, deep down, Christianity is at odds with science. And I'm going to do this in an indirect way, but I think you might find it interesting. I just sat down this morning to start listing some of the Christians who have done fundamental work in science. Here's a short list. The actual list would go on for thousands, but I just have a few. Okay, Nicholas Copernicus, founder of modern astronomy. Yeah, Copernicus, some schmuck, what does he know? Johannes Kepler, astronomy and optics. Galileo, astronomy, optics, mechanics. This is a guy who invented the telescope, okay? Kind of an important guy. Robert Boyle, physics and chemistry. When Boyle died, he left in his will an endowment for a set of lectures on the evidences of Christianity because he thought it was one of the most important things he could do. Isaac Newton, guy who invented calculus, kind of important in the foundations of physics, wrote more about the interpretation of Scripture than he did mathematical physics. He virtually never threw away a piece of paper. We have it all. Gottfried Leibniz, also co-inventor of calculus, physics, and mathematics, one of the most universal geniuses who has ever existed. Very committed to Christianity. Writes in his letters about which books of apologetics are his favorite books. Leonhard Euler, physics and mechanics. How many of you have seen the name of Euler come up in some of your math classes? Okay. Middle of the 18th century. Here's how important Euler is. If you take all of the mathematical physics, papers and books that was written during Euler's adult lifetime, and you put it in a library, uniform-sized pages, more than half of the books on the shelf are by Euler. The rest of the world gets the other part. Devout Christian. Led Bible studies with his children and with the family's servants to help to persuade them and inculcate in them deep Christian virtue and firm faith. William Herschel, one of the great astronomers of the era when telescopes were rapidly improving, end of the 18th, early 19th century. George John Romanes, evolutionary biology. He was Darwin's protege, the youngest of Darwin's proteges. Darwin came to think of him like a son, and their correspondence is just very warm. Romanes lost his faith, and then came back to it and actually wrote a book, which was incomplete at the time of his death, but as much of it as they could, they put together and published on his recovery of belief and why he had come back to Christianity. Gregor Mendel, father of genetics, pea plants. Anybody hear about Mendel? Okay. What did he do for a living? Oh, he was a monk. Check. Georges Lemaitre, Big Bang cosmology. Okay, now we're coming up into modern times. This guy, I was alive when this guy died, barely. But, Michael Faraday. Electricity, lights, power. You like that? Thank Faraday. He was a very conservative Christian. Maybe he just didn't realize that Christianity and science are incompatible, do you think? I don't know. William Thomson, Lord Kelvin, Foundations of Thermodynamics, Basic Formulations of the Laws of Thermodynamics. Kelvin was a Presbyterian and a devout one. Let's pull forward John Lennox, contemporary mathematician and physicist at Oxford University, and a devout Christian. How many of you have seen John Lennox maybe on a YouTube video or something? How many of you know who Keith and Kristen Getty are? Music? Yeah? He's Kristen Getty's uncle. Yeah. Henry Schaeffer, one of the world's leading computational chemists. Devout Christian. Writes about it, speaks about it. The guy's authored, I forget how many hundreds of papers Fritz Schaeffer has written it. He's incredibly prolific, highly cited. Alistair McGrath got his degree in molecular biophysics and then, as an adult, converted to Christianity. Then he picked up a couple of other degrees in historical theology and intellectual history, so he's got 3 doctorates. I've had the privilege of meeting Alistair and speaking with him on some occasions. Francis Collins, anybody ever hear of the Human Genome Project? Collins had his faith secured by reading C.S. Lewis's book Mere Christianity when he was in college. How many of you have read Mere Christianity? Look around, find somebody who doesn't have their hand up and help that person, right? Get a copy into their hands. You need this, trust me. James Tour is one of the 5 most highly cited nanotech chemists in the world. Is a devout Christian, runs Bible studies regularly with his students and his friends. And I'll just end with my friend, Andrew Pinsent. He's kind of a bright guy. He's got a doctorate in philosophy from St. Louis University. He's got a theology degree from the Pontifical Institute in Rome, and he has a doctorate in nuclear physics from Oxford. Kind of knows science. Now, let me just make this question really blunt. Were these scientists, and are these scientists, Christians because they did not realize that faith and science are incompatible? Is that why they're making fundamental contributions and have been historically all along in all kinds of disciplines? Well, that's what Jerry Coyne would have to say. Yeah, they can do science, but they must just not get it. Well, what does not getting it amount to if they're doing fundamental, important, highly cited work in science? I think Isaac Newton counts as highly cited. Do you really think they didn't get it? Or instead, were they and are they Christians because they thought Christianity is reasonable and explains the evidence better than the alternatives? I submit to you that Jerry Coyne has a problem. And his problem is that he doesn't really understand the nature of the kind of faith that the Christian religion asks people to have. He's still locked into this idea that it's blind belief. And the people I've just cited, and many like them, give us reason to think otherwise. But let's go over to the other side and let someone else speak, an eminent biologist, Richard Lewontin, in a review of a book by Carl Sagan, talks about how odd science seems to some people and how some people complain that it locks out religion. And here's what he has to say about it. Not a religious guy, okay? We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. Hey, this guy's being honest. Listen to him. He's telling you why he's on the science side of a science versus faith opposition. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world. But on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes, we're forced by that to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Is that the deliverance of biology, or is that a piece of philosophy? Yeah, it's a philosophical position. The man who tells you that philosophy is dead is a philosopher with something to sell you. Just be alert. Okay? If that quotation from Lewontin was too long for you, here's the short version. Religious faith would require us to believe that there's a God who could work miracles, and we absolutely refuse to believe that. Well, you can do that, right? But we live in this wonderful free country, and you can refuse to believe those things, and nobody comes along and puts you into a white suit and carries you away. But you do lose the moral and the rhetorical high ground at that point. And that's a high ground that, in other contexts, Lewontin and people like him want to stake out and claim as their own. There's a simple question that I like to ask people who say things like that, and that question is, if you are wrong, how will you find out? I won't ever accept a supernatural explanation. Okay, well, if the supernatural is real, how will you find out? It's a really good question. It's worth asking yourself as well. When should I change my mind? Now, I stand before you as someone who is persuaded that Christianity is true. And so I have no hesitation at all in saying, look at the evidence. Follow the evidence. Let's go with that. And apparently, neither did a whole bunch of people who were eminent scientists, past and present. So, when somebody says, no, we can't allow a divine foot in the door, ask him, if you're wrong, how are you going to discover that? How are you going to find that out? Well, I'll do it by science. Not the way you've just defined science. Because you've just defined this as something that can't let you do that. So you have a philosophical problem with the way that you're approaching science. But maybe there's an argument behind this, and I'll just do this as a kind of a wrap-up, and then we'll open it for Q&A. Miracles, yeah, but they're by definition violations of the laws of nature. But science discovers the laws of nature. So to believe in miracles is to go against science, right? Now there's a short argument. It seems so reasonable and so simple. Is it really? Well, every time you see an argument and there's a definition thrown in, pay real close attention to the definition. Look at the definition here. Miracles are violations of the laws of nature. I have an alternative definition for you. The laws of nature tell us how the physical universe behaves when it's left to itself. But they don't tell us whether it's always left to itself. Those are different questions, aren't they? I mean, if I'm a bird and I've lived in the forest for many years, happily at the top of a tall tree, and I fly off to the marsh to eat grubs for the day, and when I come back, my tree is lying on the forest floor, severed cleanly at its base. And I said, this is totally outside of my experience. I've seen storms knock down old trees that are rotting out, but my tree had lush foliage and there was nothing wrong with it. I just don't get this. And then I fly off to the Avian Philosophy Center and I ask some of my fellow birds, hey, what's going on about this? What are they going to tell me? Are you sure it was your tree? I just don't believe you. Trees don't just get broken off flat at the base like that. And some of them will no doubt say your tree never existed. But we know what's going on, right? Somebody from outside of the system has intervened. People have come along with chainsaws to cut that down. I can't put that into my categories because the forest is no longer being left to itself. Yeah, this isn't the way the forest behaves when left to itself. It's not being left to itself. And that's the true explanation for what's going on. So let's try not to be too bird-brained in the way that we think about science and miracles. I'll stop there. I know some of you got to get up and run to your next class. It's cool. I'll just assume you hate what I was saying. And the rest of you, we can talk for a little while. If you've got any questions, I would welcome that. So just go ahead. Anybody who's brave enough to stick a hand in the air can do it. And nobody wants to be the first one. So I should just like, yeah, no, you do. Okay, you're good. Tag, you're it.
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask you about you had an initial chart where you were talking about like science and non-essential beliefs, like that may conflict. Mm-hmm. Would you consider the historical Adam a non-essential belief? Because I've seen a lot of...
Yeah, so let me tell you, here's trying to, let's see, F5, 7, enter. There we go. So that one, so you're asking, so, what are the non-essential rather than the essential beliefs? And the answer is, there's some tension on that. I have strong views on that. And in my view, the historical Adam is not something negotiable, mainly because I think it's very, very clear that Jesus believed that there was an Adam and an Eve. And he talks about them, and he makes points that don't make any sense if that's an allegory.
Right.
However, God allows us to be wrong about a fair amount of stuff as long as we're not wrong about the core stuff. And the core thing that you need to be right about is that you are a sinner and you are under the wrath of God and you stand in need of a grace you cannot earn. And Jesus Christ, by dying on the cross and rising from the dead, has bridged that gap, which is otherwise unbridgeable. And you have to commit yourself to Jesus Christ. Now, I think you can do that and still be messed up. And if you were my friend and you were messed up in those ways, I would endeavor to help you. But I think God can still accept people who are messed up in that way. So I think there's a historical Adam, and I think it matters that there was a historical Adam. But I think so great is the divine humility that he even accepts those of us who are messed up on things that are pretty important, as long as we truly believe the essential things.
Right. Because, like, I don't know if you've read the new edition of Evidence Demands a Verdict, but...
I have it. I have not yet read it.
Oh, okay. I would say they have a section on the historical Adam in there, and he talks about different sciences to say that you can't have two. It has to be like 10,000, you know, you have to have this really large number.
Right.
And
I've seen those arguments. My wife even has a blog post, which I can send the URL for around, and so if y'all are tapped into the leadership here, they can share it with you. It turns out that the scientific arguments that create that genetic bottleneck are actually making a whole bunch of assumptions that are not founded in the science itself. And when you make those assumptions, you will get problems. But the problems come from the assumptions. It's kind of like fracking. You know, you force in something foreign to the geology, and then it breaks up. And then you say, oh, wow, this broke up. It must not have been solid. No, you forced other stuff in there. That's what broke it up. So,
can you give us some examples? Like, what are some of the things that they're doing?
Mutation rate assumptions. They're assuming that all genes mutate at the same rate. This is wildly untrue. We know that not all genes mutate at the same rate. You get very different, wildly different estimates for that population size depending on which sections of which genes you're looking at. And they're choosing the ones that give them the big numbers. And they're also making other assumptions to get to those numbers about the independence of mutations, for example, that are required to get that. I would refer you to my wife's article, and I'll send out the URL for that so that you can pick that up. I think you would find it interesting. She has citations to the scientific literature all through it, so you can actually go through and chase down the sources yourself.
Appreciate that.
You bet. Yeah.
Okay, I hear this a lot from like non-believers or maybe agnostics. Some people say, it's kind of like how they say science, religion can't mix. But I always ask people, do you not believe that you can pray about something but also put effort? Like, do you not believe that a doctor could be a believer or a scientist? Like, people will say, no, don't thank God, thank the person themselves.
What if the person is thanking God?
Yeah. Can you think that God can work through people?
Absolutely, and can use means to do things, right? When the church at Jerusalem was experiencing some severe financial trouble due to some famine in the area, and the Apostle Paul went out and collected money from other churches to bring it to them, why didn't God just make piles of gold coins appear? Because God doesn't work like that. God uses human beings, and it's valuable for us to be in part of the process. Why do Christian doctors do surgery and immunize? Because they know that God doesn't just shake miracles out of the salt shaker for nothing. Right? There are important, if you look at the Bible, there are like 3 major places where there are significant numbers of miracles, and then throughout the rest, hardly any. Jesus even says at one point, you know, how many widows do you think there were in the time of Elijah? There were lots of them. Did God send a prophet to every one of them? No, just to one. So God's not like a Band-Aid or a magic trick that you can do that is going to fix things that you can work towards with your own hands. And people who think he is are victims not of religion, but of bad theology. And one of the biggest driving forces of a lot of skepticism is bad theology, often from people who should know better because they came out of Christian backgrounds, but either they got bad theology or they discovered that it's convenient to assume it. But it's just bad theology to say, well, you can either do surgery or pray for the person. Why not both? Of course. So I think your answer makes complete sense, and I think they need to get over the fact that they're just misdescribing what Christians have believed and should believe. You can always find a few, right, who are like, no, it's all just direct miracles. Benny Hinn slaying people in the spirit on stage. I've often thought that Benny would be much better employed at a hospital where the people are lying in bed and don't have any money to give him, and God's power could be manifested right away there. If God's really just like healing people, how come it's only when Benny is making money and on his stage? No. Sorry, faulty view of God, not a view of God that we are enjoined to pick up in the New Testament. So, yeah, I completely agree that that's just a misguided line of criticism, but a very common one.
I always think, like, why does it have to be one or the other? Because sometimes he could answer a prayer or something you're asking in a different way that you expected.
Yeah, right.
It's like if I said I want food, obviously I'm not going to snap my fingers and then food's going to pop up. Maybe he could send someone who could donate money to help me to get food, or someone who brings food.
Or
Like
give
that.
you a job, or
Something
what?
of
Yeah.
that, something
Right.
of that nature.
Yeah, and then there are the people who are like, no, I don't want a job. I'm waiting for God to drop my feast in front of me. Well, Chick-fil-A is right over there, but you need a little cash, so how about if you do a job? But, I don't know. People are funny. Yeah, more questions. Yeah.
So you mentioned how some of these scientific naturalists will sort of assume that materialism, they'll just take that as given.
And they say so. They're real upfront about it, yeah.
And so there's no way that they could sort of work themselves out of that system doing science, because they've sort of
Well,
established that.
once you say, I won't allow myself to look at anything except material causes and material explanations, surprise, you'll never come up with anything but material causes and material explanations,
So-
even if they're not really what's going on.
So my worry is that sometimes this can apply to Christians too, because
Yes.
there'll be things like presuppositionalism where you could never be wrong on that sort of view, and so how do we check for that on our side, I guess?
Ask yourself the question, if I'm wrong, how will I know? Ask yourself the question, when should I change my mind? Be honest about it and follow the evidence. Because you're right, we can lock ourselves in with trapdoor arguments too. And that's a bad place for anybody to be. God is not asking you to check your brains at the door. Keep your eyes open, learn. If you have honest questions, things you're having trouble reconciling, find people who are wise. What is it about our being individuals that makes us say, no, I'm not going to look at what anybody else said. I'm going to do it on my own. Lots of atheist websites will tell you, just read the Bible. Don't read any commentaries. Why? You've got people who've spent, collectively centuries of study to produce these commentaries where they've looked up the original meanings of things and put things in cultural context. Wouldn't you want to know this? The Bible was written for us, but it was not written to us. Matthew was writing for first century readers. To understand what he's writing as he understood himself, you need to learn something about that. Ask people who've spent the time to learn it. There's no shame in that. It's kind of ridiculous. Nobody would say, read quantum physics for yourself. Don't ask anybody what all those symbols and equations mean. Going to become a physicist, are we? Not the right way to do it. So don't be ashamed to learn from people who have put in the time and the study. Find people like that. Seek them out. You're sitting next to somebody here who can do that for you. Alan, raise your hand so that everybody sees you. This is Alan. He's kind of a smart guy. Anybody use Google Earth? Thank Alan. You're using his software. Okay? This is a guy you should be making use of. He's right here in the area, lives over near Dallas. He'll come over here and speak if you want him to. Make use of the people around you. They're actually there. Find out who they are and make grateful use of them. More questions?
You got one?
Yeah, so
Mason?
people are commonly bringing up Galileo and that's usually one of the first objections that kids on campus hear.
But Galileo!
Yeah, so
What about Galileo?
Well, that he was persecuted by the church.
Okay, so
and
let's-
just kind of like that fake history, just kind of.
Let's set the record straight on this, okay? Number one, Galileo was lifelong a devout Catholic.
Yeah.
He was not a crypto-atheist or a freethinker or an agnostic or a deist. Number two, when Galileo was brought to trial, the accusation was that he had signed a letter from Cardinal Bellarmine telling him not to hold, maintain, defend, or discuss, even hypothetically, the Copernican view. So he's called into the Inquisition, who are saying, you just wrote this whole book on this, and you promised you wouldn't even discuss it hypothetically. The letter actually didn't have his signature on it. It didn't even have Cardinal Bellarmine's signature on it. It wasn't written in Cardinal Bellarmine's handwriting, and Galileo had an actual letter from Cardinal Bellarmine, which he pulled out, which did not tell him that he couldn't discuss it hypothetically. So see, this is the real letter. The Inquisition, now look, I take a dim view of pulling people in for Inquisition, but let's just let history be set straight. They decided to let him go with a plea bargain. He would agree that accidentally he had made the Copernican view seem a little stronger than he should have, and they would say, now, please don't do that, and he would go home. They signed the paperwork, they set it up the chain. We have the paperwork, this is not guesswork, okay? Maurice Finocchiaro has a book called The Galileo Affair, a documentary history, and he's got translations of all of the primary sources. They set it up for approval, and the Pope said, not good enough. Remanded the decision, told them they had to question him again under threat of torture, though he was never actually tortured, and find him guilty of something worse. Politically, the Pope's embroiled at this point in the 30 Years' War. He needed to make a strong statement of himself as the defender of the Catholic faith in a stronger sense. So the Inquisition was told, it's not good enough. You have to condemn him for something. Of the 10 members of the Board of Inquisition, only 7 actually signed the final condemnation, and they did everything they could to make it less arduous for him. You're under arrest at the house of the Tuscan ambassador. Oh, you can just go home. Just stay there. You're under house arrest in your own house. Okay. The 3 people who wouldn't sign it, one of them was the Pope's own nephew. All right, so, yeah, was Galileo treated improperly? Yes. Was that because Christianity hates science? No, it was because the Pope was involved in a political situation and perhaps also thought that Galileo was poking fun at him at a certain point in his dialogue concerning the 2 chief world systems. I don't know that Galileo intended that, but that's what lay behind it. Not religion and science. Some very human person involved in very human kinds of political struggles, and one guy who got caught in the cogs. Copernicus didn't suffer anything for it. In fact, Cardinal Schoenberg wrote to him and said, I'm so interested that you've got a new system where the Earth moves around the sun. Can you make a copy of it? I'll pay for the copy. I'd like to make a copy at my own expense so that I can read what you're saying because your work is so highly praised. Copernicus wasn't in any trouble at all. But in between Copernicus and Galileo was the Council of Trent, which was the Catholic Church's way of coping with the Protestant Reformation, and a lot of things got stickier at that point. So the real history is much more interesting and much less black and white. Those guys on the Board of Inquisition who would not sign the condemnation of Galileo, are they good guys, bad guys? What do we say? Certainly, they stood up for something. Anything else?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so from hearing you speak, I think it's safe to say you are young Earth creationist, right?
No.
Okay. All right.
No. Actually, I think the universe is about 13.6, 13.7 billion years old.
Okay.
And I think that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, roughly. But I know extremely intelligent, well-informed people who don't hate science, who disagree with me. And that's okay. And we can make common cause because we have a lot more in common then we do things that we disagree about. So I'm not going to make that an issue for somebody who wants to, but that I think that falls into non-essential beliefs. I think the earth is old. I think I have excellent evidence for that. I'd be happy to talk to you about that evidence if this were, if you want to hang around later, we can talk about nuclides and reservoirs and things like that. But that's not an essential belief. If you hold that the earth is very young, that does not line up well with the current consensus. The current consensus could change. I don't expect it to. I think in that respect, it'll be refined but not substantially changed. But that's not the heart of Christianity. If the earth is 4.5 billion years old and Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity is true. If the earth is 4,500 years old or 6,000 years old or 10,000 years old and Jesus is dead in a tomb, Christianity is false. And Paul makes that really clear in 1 Corinthians 15, where he said, it's if Christ is not raised, you're still in your sins. If Christ is not raised, we are of all men most miserable. Fair answer?
Yes, fair answer. But where was going with this?
Yeah.
This is a little silly, I would admit, but I don't know. Where in the Bible would you say dinosaurs speak? Is it like before the events accounting the Bible, after, where, if you looked into that?
Yeah, so there's actually a variety of viewpoints on that are compatible with an old earth. And what I would suggest is there's a little booklet put out by Presbyterian Church of America. They had a creation study committee, and the members of the committee did not agree with one another. So what they did was each devotees of each perspective wrote a section putting forward their own interpretation. And then people from other perspectives sent questions to them, and they print out those questions, and then each group has a chance to respond to those questions, and those questions get raised in that discussion. So what I would suggest you do is have a look at each of the views and see how people who are sincere and devout Christians wrestle with these issues from each of these perspectives.
And where can I find those writings?
I will give it to you. Do you have a computer with you now or a flash drive?
No.
Okay, then just give your contact information to Ben or somebody, and I'll give my contact information to you. Email me, and I will email you a PDF of it. Fair? All right. Anybody else? Ken?
I was just going to say, with respect to the Galileo incident, in summary, if you were to just accept everything the antagonists to Christianity were wanting to say, in the end, all they're saying is that people at the head of churches sometimes do and say bad and stupid things.
Do you think?
And is that a revelation to anybody?
Yeah. I'm shocked to hear that you think that any Christians ever behave badly. Well, yeah. What's the whole church discipline thing about, right? What is Paul talking about in his letters to the Corinthian church? Yeah, of course people behave badly who profess Christianity. Sometimes they behave badly and say they're doing it because they have to, because they're Christians. Doesn't make them right. And we should be willing and able to stand up and criticize them. Look, some people, not all, in the 19th century defended slavery by pointing to passages from the Bible. And other people condemned slavery and fought the Civil War because they also were reading their Bibles. I know which side I think was doing it right. But yeah, people will invent all kinds of reasons to justify what they're doing or to say that it doesn't matter. I will just say, and I'm not going to push this any further than this, but there are some very prominent atheists who have very recently gotten into some trouble with some accusations about their conduct, which are as unflattering as accusations about the conduct of any minister you've ever heard about. And I don't condemn all atheists because some atheists have misbehaved. So don't do that to us either, is how I would respond to people who do that.
I just want to ask how long you're going to stay Are you leaving like immediately after
I will hang around for, half an hour. If you just want to talk some more, I'll just hang out here. I know you guys have places to go, things to do, and that's all good. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.